Don't stop it. We're keeping it. Really though, pure mathematics.
All right, pure mathematics. Well, the whole thing about pure mathematics, this is one of those terms that is unfortunate that Kant uses because it's entirely misleading as far as the way he's talking about it. When he talks about pure mathematics as one of the first approaches to doing metaphysics, right? This is one of the possibilities as far as using a synthetic a priori to do metaphysics. I know when I would think about this, especially when I was an undergrad, I got this idea of some guy with the big forehead sitting down and poring over numbers and symbols and all sorts of things like that. This is the image of doing pure mathematics that I had. And this isn't really what Kant has in mind at all. When Kant talks about pure mathematics, he's talking about something that corresponds in the Critique of Pure Reason to a section he calls the Transcendental Analytic. And what it has to do with is a breakdown. The transcendental means going across experience, right? So the basic foundations for something. And analytic has to do with the basic terms by which we think. So the Transcendental Analytic is going across the basic terms by which we think.
What do you mean by going across the basic terms?
Going across the principle that holds all of it together. What he's asking about is what, with pure mathematics, isn't how is it that you would add things together or subtract things or do algebra or do, some even more complex sort of thing. Quantification of differential equations or any sort of thing like that.
It's always the word that comes to mind, isn't it? Phrase. Right. Differential equations.
Differential equations, yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of things you can do with very complex mathematics, but in a way that's going in a different direction from what he's talking about. What he's talking about is more fundamental. He thinks that there is that when he talks about mathematics, math is this way of synthesizing, so putting together a priori concepts, basic conditions for thinking that are true prior to experience.
So that was the synthetic a priori that you were just talking about.
Right. But they're also, and this is the thing that's important about them, they're also what he calls intuitive. Now, so when he talks about pure mathematics, he's talking about how is it that the mind approaches this thing called the Transcendental Analytic. How is it that it goes across the basic terms by which it thinks? And when he asks that, he's asking what are the underlying terms by which we're able to make this synthesis, the synthesizing, possible. Now the thing that he's going to recognize with this, he's going to have a couple avenues with this, but one of the avenues that he gets is that he says, well, if you're going to investigate what makes it possible for us to synthesize, as it were, in the synthetic a priori, what is it that makes it possible for us our mind to put things together? You're going to have to look at what he calls intuition. Okay.
That doesn't sound like it has anything to do with mathematics.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to do with mathematics in the ordinary ways that we think about it. But you got to think about what mathematics is. Mathematics isn't about counting. It's not about symbols. It's not even really about logic. What mathematics is, and one of the things that's so profound about mathematics for Kant, is that mathematics can lead us to certain degrees, certain levels of truth that we don't have to think about, that they're known to be true without any sort of inference.
So a priori, right?
So a priori, but not even just a priori, intuitive. I mean, this is where he comes with intuitive. Intuition for Kant is not. It's not. We were talking about this a little bit earlier, off camera. Intuition is not a matter of gut level thinking, right? When you say I have an intuition of something, and you mean, well, how do you know? So I don't know it. I just intuit it. It's just a feeling you have. That's not all Kant means.
I have a stomach flu.
Right. He doesn't mean that. What Kant means by intuition is something that is known because it's simply present in the mind. And the interesting thing that he recognizes about this is that when we think mathematically, what we're trying to do is use lines of reasoning to arrive back at these basic intuitions. Now, in math, you don't call these intuitions. You know what you call them? You call them axioms. You call them basic axes of truth that you hold to be the case. I mean, you got to remember what is an axiom. Like if you've ever taken geometry, right, or any of these higher math classes. Geometry's not all that high, but anything above that, you have these axioms. And what an axiom is it's a truth that you hold to be the case that you can't prove is true. You can't prove axioms are true. But you hold axioms as true because on the basis of holding these axioms as true, you're able to demonstrate all these other mathematical principles that are at work, right? That's what you're able to do.
Wasn't that Descartes? The axioms? Cartesian...
Descartes operating in a similar sort of way. They're both
Okay.
operating on these geometric terms. But what Kant's going to go in a different direction with this,
Yeah.
because Kant's recognizing basically what Descartes thought arrived at as this fundamental point, and he's going to show that these intuitions, an intuition, I guess if you were to take the intuition of something like the cogito, that Descartes tried to arrive at and then work from, and show that even this, even though it is intuitively true, still has to exist within experience. And because it exists within experience, it still has the limits that Hume talked about. It's not, in other words, going to be able to... It's a synthetic a priori proposition, but it's not going to be able to carry the ball of metaphysics the whole 9 yards, as it were. It's not going to be able to go as far as it needs to be able to go.
I meant Descartes in the mathematical sense with the axioms.
Yeah.
That was him too, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Cartesian graph.
Yeah, that's what I
Right,
wasn't sure.
and analytical geometry.
Yeah.
These are all the same things, and they're all coming from this idea, and Kant's recognizing this. I mean, that this is one of the great problems that comes up out of the history of Western thought generally, is that there's this incredible rigor of thought. There's this incredible capacity to use logic. I mean, I gotta say, I'm interested in all sorts of different kinds of philosophy all over the world. And if there is one thing that Western thought is really good at, it is good at the rigor of logical thought. Indian thought's very good at this too, but Western thought maybe even better. It's wonderful at thinking the ideas down, breaking them down, coming to this point that says, look, you cannot go underneath this because the entire possibility to proceed depends upon this ground. It gets to that point, but the problem is you don't really know what's underneath that ground. Hume was the first guy to really crack that in the Western tradition, and the reason why he could crack it in the Western tradition is because he recognized how much this ground, supposedly that we thought was there, still depended upon the habits by which our mind put things together. And Kant recognizes that, and Kant tries to use that logic. He tries to use that reasoning to get to that ground, and he says, you know what? Hume is right. You can't get underneath that. You can't, at least not through the power of pure mathematics. You can get down to that axiom. You can get down to that basic intuition. But you can't get any further than that. Now, one of the questions that comes up, you might want to ask with this, is saying, all right, so axioms. What are these axioms? Can you identify what these axioms are, these pure mathematics? And Kant actually does. What he does is he says, all right, we build concepts, right? So we have this experience, we use reason, we build these concepts. And he gets more into the details of this in the pure natural science section that we'll talk about. But when it comes down to the basic aspects of just how is it possible to even begin building these things, he says there's two basic axioms, two basic mediums that are at work here. You have, and this is what makes up intuition, right? He says that there is a possibility of distinguishing between things, right? Between one object and the other in the mind. The capacity to distinguish between one thing and another thing in the mind, this is what makes up space for Kant, right? So space isn't something that's out there exactly. We know space is something that's out there. But we know space is something out... This is tricky, but we know space is something that's out there because we have this capacity to think spatially. And how is it we're capable of thinking spatially? It's because we're capable of making distinctions between one thing and another.
So is Kant saying that space is in our mind? Or is he saying that
Almost.
space is, but we know that because of how we think?
What he is saying is that there is a condition which gives rise to that which we call space. But that which we call space, not the condition that gives rise to... It's unfortunate I have to put it this way. Not that which gives rise to what we call space, but that which we call space is in our minds. That which gives rise to it, well, that's the noumenal. That's something that's out there. We don't know whether it's real or whether it's just a product of our mind, but it's a similar point to what Hume had. We can't get past the parameter of it. We have this idea called space. It's this capacity to distinguish between things. It seems like this basic principle for talking about the world around us, right? And that basic principle is part of our thinking. It's not part of the world, but it's it's not exactly.
So would Hume have called it a matter of habit?
Yeah,
This
more or
would have
less.
been- okay.
More or less, he would have come from that.
Okay.
There's a second axiom that's involved in this too, and that's as you would imagine, time. When Kant says time is the capacity, and it's the innermost of these. It's the capacity to make the distinction not between things but within things. Right? So that if we ask this question, and maybe it's a question that you might have asked yourself before with this, what exactly is time? It's something that we're aware of, and we're aware of it ubiquitously. We're aware of it as we think, but what is it? Well, Kant. One of the brilliant things about Kant is Kant's capable of identifying this, and the way that he's capable of identifying it is he says, what is it that we do when we temporalize, when the mind temporalizes, right? When it thinks in a time-like way. That's what this means. And what it means is that we hold these ideas. We have ideas in certain ways. And within these ideas, there are dynamics, there are shifts, there are what we call motion, there are what we call change. There are distinctions in the way things are held together. And our mind observes this, and when it observes this, it calls this temporality. So, we have the distinctions between things, space. We have the distinctions within things, time. And just take a moment, think about this for a second. I mean, this is absolutely fundamental to anything. And I don't just mean physical things. I mean anything. Space and time are fundamental to the way that we conceptualize, right? This is why this guy is talking about this as axiomatic. This is the basis by which concepts are there. But the problem is, and Kant's recognizing this, and he is spot on with regard. He's saying Hume basically anticipated this. The problem is that this is us. This isn't the noumenal. This isn't the truth out there that we're trying to get to with metaphysics. This is what's here. And think about this. If you can't get past this wall that is your mind thinking about these things, if you can't do that, how do you know that? How do you get to the metaphysics? And if you can't get to the metaphysics, how do you know this truth that you've got to know, that we were talking about before? How do you know this? How do you get to this truth where you can know the truth of God, or know the truth of goodness, or know the truth of beauty, or know the truth of even physics? You're trapped not just within experience, but within the idioms by which your mind has to go to understand this experience. Right? That's the problem you're facing. That's the trick within this. You can't get past your intuition. I mean, it's interesting. Kant is willing to entertain at different points. He says we might suppose, and indeed we do suppose, in mysticism and fantasy, as he puts it, that we can imagine objects beyond space and time. But these are pure illusion. And the way in which he shows this is that he says, you try to tell me what an object you imagine beyond space and time is. People talk about a mystical experience of God, right? Oh, I know God, who's the Alpha and the Omega, the eternity of all things, and God is present to me right here, right now. And this is what God is supposed to be, right? This is what God's supposed to be. And then Kant says, fine, I agree. And keep in mind, too, Kant, unlike Hume, Kant's a religious guy. Kant's not, Hume is about the definition of an agnostic. But Kant, he's a Lutheran. He's about as Lutheran as you get. But he says, you try to tell me what exactly that is. Or you try to tell me what the soul is. Or you try to tell me what infinity is, right? An infinite universe is. Or you try to tell me what freedom, the possibility of fundamentally making something is. You try to tell me what that is. Because you're going to have to try to get outside of space and time in order to do that. You're going to have to try to define this without having appeal to the basic terms of your differentiation between things and your differentiation within things. You're going to have to get this basic category upon which things are. And you can't do it. It is not just impossible, or it's not just hard. It's impossible. It's beyond impossible. It's meaningless. Right? You tell me where a thing is. Describe God, who is a thing that is not in space and not in time. And other than saying, oh, well, it's not in space and not in time, and you're going, wow, that's really intense, you can't imagine a thing. This is what you got.
Wait, God is a thing that's not in space or time? Describing him as not being that way?
Yeah, that's the problem. What he's trying... Yeah, Kant's saying that when you try to imagine something, this would be a metaphysical concept that you'd actually be trying to imagine. If you wanted to use metaphysics as a science, as a way of knowing, and you're trying to know God, and that would mean knowing God but beyond the boundaries of space and time, which are, part of our mind of thinking, right? With me?
Yeah.
Okay. Then what you end up imagining doesn't end up being anything at all. It's literally incoherent. That's the problem. You try to imagine a metaphysical concept as a science, a fundamental truth, doesn't depend upon the terms of thinking, and you end up about the nature of reality, and you end up with nothing. Okay? So this is what happens when we try to do this with these intuitions, with these basic axioms by which reasoning works. Okay? Does that make? I don't even know does that make sense to you guys? You following that?
Well, can you clarify one more time the relationship between mathematics and intuition?
Yeah, mathematics. I'll try. Mathematics. When Kant talks about mathematics, he, like so many of these guys, seems to be talking probably more about geometry in many ways than anything else. But what he's talking about is that mathematics tries to use reason to dig down and arrive at some sort of self-evident principle. And if it's arriving at some self-evident principle, it's basically trying to arrive at some basic condition of thinking. Now then,
an axiom?
Yeah, an axiom. And then Kant asks, so what are these axioms? Can we say anything about them? What do we describe them? And the axioms he identifies are space and time. Not the way we think about space and time, because we think about space and time in terms of the things that fill up space and time. But he talks about them in terms of how does space go about spacing itself? How does time go about timing itself? Space goes about spacing itself by being a distinction between things, and insofar as it does that, it's axiomatic. Time goes about being time by differentiating within things, and insofar as that, it temporalizes, makes these possibilities.
And so what makes that axiomatic exactly?
Because you can't get beyond that.
Can't get beyond it, okay.
It is like spaces without having to take up space. Time temporalizes without having to take up time. Everything else has to take it up. I mean, you can't. Space and time they're like. It's really helpful to think about them as like lines, like an x-axis and a y-axis. Just try to think about this. Like, try to think about an object that that exists that doesn't take up any space. And I don't mean just doesn't take up any physical space, because people can think, oh, well, what about a note of music or something like that? Well, it's true that a note of music doesn't take up physical space, but it takes up musical space because a note of music is distinct between one note and another note, right?
And justice?
Just something like justice can still take up space in terms of, I guess it would be, I don't know if you call it just space or not, but it could take up a place between law and chaos, or something like that. I mean, we're talking about a conceptual space, right? That's what he means. It's important. This is another example of why Kant's really tricky language really is significant, because he's very precise. Space is the distinction between things. If you ask what's the space of justice, and I say, and I don't know if this would be right or not, but if I say it's between, order and chaos, or something like that, I'm not totally satisfied with that. But what I've done is I've made a distinction of this place between these two concepts.
It's a distinction, it's not a measurement, though.
Right.
Because that's what time does.
Well, time, both space and time do a kind of measurement, but they do a kind of measurement in that they do a distinguishing, a conceptual distinguishing. One is between space, one is within time. It's hard. It's really basic, but that's what's so powerful about it. These terms. Just think about it this way. If we say there are concepts, and when we talk about concepts, there is that which is between concepts, and that there is that within concepts. And if we can somehow find cracks even underneath those, perhaps we would begin to find something that would move beyond our intuitions of what Kant calls pure mathematics. Right? But I'm not sure we can. I mean, he's getting pretty basic as far as how we can think about this stuff. Yeah, go ahead.
So is the space between concepts what allows us to understand concepts in themselves?
Well, we never really get to concepts in themselves. We recognize that there are concepts, and we distinguish between them. And Kant, he seems to think that we have a sense of the reality of these things. I mean, he's not going to be quite the skeptic that someone like Hume is, where Hume just basically says, well, look, we don't know what's in the outside world. It seems to be something, but the very habit that there is an outside world that we would suppose also seems to be a matter of habit. Kant's not going to go that far. Kant's going to say, no, there's always seems to be a condition that gives rise to the possibility of these things. There's always something that's there beforehand that we have to know. The problem is that we've got these methods of thinking. We got this one method of thinking called spatializing, where we separate between things. And when we talk about what's between those things, we call that space. We got this way of making distinctions within concepts, how one concept moves and evolves in itself and becomes another concept and becomes another concept, and that all those three concepts are part of a larger concept that itself is becoming, and we call that time, right? That event that's happening. That there's these basic conditions that are there. But the problem, and this is sort of the key thing here, Kant says, as far as the noumenal phenomenal distinction that we were talking about before it goes, that's on the phenomenal side of the fence. right? It all has to do with us. It all has to do with our habit of thinking, our habit of looking at between things, our habit of looking at within things, what we got to do to bring to the concept. It's not what makes the concept itself, but what we bring to it. So even something like mathematics, sort of the basic terms by which we reduce everything down to this point and say we would make these deductions about the world, it's not going to tell us the way things are. At least not necessarily. It's still telling us more about ourselves than it is about the world out there. I guess maybe this might be a way of approaching. Let's try this approach with all these definitions here. Think about quantifying the universe, and think about what that is supposed to do, right? There's a lot of people who would, a lot of physicists, a lot of philosophers, who would try to say that if you were going to know about what the world is, if you want to know what's real, what you would do is you would try to find some way to apply quantities to the universe. Right? You try to say there's this many things and that there's these kind of distinctions between all the things that are out there.
Like the physicists now who try to measure all the matter
right.
and the antimatter,
like Stephen Hawking, who tries to, amongst others, like Brian Greene. These people who try to reduce ways of thinking about the world to some singular principle or set of principles that can be quantified in some mathematical way. Now, this is not to say that this is not a worthwhile and powerful endeavor. It is. But if you're asking a philosopher about this and saying, well, when the physicist, whatever track they might be, tries to quantify the universe in one way or another, whatever avenue they're taking with it, right? So they measure these things out and observe these patterns and apply very, very complex and intricate mathematical properties to these things and say, this is what this is. And then they say, so there are strings that run through the universe. Or there might be parallel universes, the way Brian Greene talks about.
Those would be loops.
Yeah. Right. Or that you can reduce and come down to some basic property of the material universe, because beyond this point you can't quantify it anymore. What a Kantian would say about this, as far as pure mathematics goes, and this is all, I mean, you think about this is all what pure mathematics is basically trying to do. It's not just counting, it's applying the principle that you could quantify, that you could apply these axioms down on this and then map them out in terms of space and time, is that all of this is fascinating, but it has to do with you in relation to the cosmos, not the cosmos itself. And that's huge when it comes to metaphysics.
So pure mathematics can never get us to metaphysics.
What pure mathematics can do is bring us to the mirror of the cosmos and help us gaze very intensely at ourselves. But it can never actually help us see through it.
So we can gaze very intensely at the phenomenal, but we can never see through to the noumenal?
Yeah, that's right. Because to some extent it's very hard to know what it would even mean to see through to the noumenal.
So is the main difference between Kant and Hume simply that Kant has faith in these axioms and in this noumenal reality?
Perhaps there are people who have thought that before. I mean, I think one of the things but I don't think so entirely myself. I think that there's, and I'm not persuaded one way or the other, although I'll admit I'm probably more on the side of Hume than on this. But I think what Kant thinks is that when he thinks about how our minds have to proceed, he's very aware that there are certain really, really basic operations our mind has to do even to begin to think. I mean, when we talk about this, what is space and what is time? Distinction between things, distinction within things. He's not just saying, well, this is arbitrary. so it's whatever, and it's subjective. That's not what he's saying. He's saying you have to think within these ideas, because the whole process called rationality proceeds through that, right? I mean, that's what reasoning is. That's what understanding is. Hume says, well, I don't know that you have to do that. That seems to be a matter of habit. And while I admit perhaps I have to do that, or I'm in the habit of thinking that, I don't see anything about that experience that claims it is necessary other than the fact that I feel like I have to do it. And the only way I've ever demonstrated that I had to do it was because my mind said I had to do it. The reason I like Hume is because Hume keeps it kind of closer to the chest, you know. Hume doesn't go any further. He doesn't make any claim broader about the nature of thinking than what is immediate. Whereas Kant's saying, no, I can't see how this logic would proceed otherwise. I'm impressed with Kant, but I'm convinced by Hume. And
what about the idea that because we take place, like when we think about something, we have an idea that might be controversial, that it takes place, that it's measurable by time, that it takes place in space, that it is a part of the cosmos, it's a part of all of these things, it's a part of the cosmos, it's a part of time, it's a part of space. And so because it's a part of all of these things, doesn't it in a way have access in some way to these things?
You're thinking about space as though it's separate from the operations of the mind, and that's the way you're talking about it. Like if it has access to space or access to time, you can't think that way about it. I mean, it's not to say that there's don't make the distinction. Don't make the mistake of thinking, well, so it's all subjective. It's all in my mind. It's more to say that space is something that I impose upon the events of the world because of the way in which I think, and time is something I impose upon the events of the world because of the way in which I think. Space and time don't have properties of their own out there. When they have properties, they have the properties because of my way of thinking with it. So that there's a problem with the way you ask the question with regard to that.
Well, I wasn't really thinking about those things existing because of my mind. That wasn't what you were saying, was it?
No.
I was just saying that if I have a thought about something, if I have an opinion about something, if I'm thinking about something, and especially about something like God, right? That because the way that I think about something, because it takes up time, because it takes up space, because it takes up part of the cosmos, just like, isn't there some kind of way, doesn't it seem like there's a way that because I'm taking part in all of these things, and these are the things that are involved with art?
No, but the problem it's the way that you're using the word.
Okay.
You're saying that it takes up time and it takes up space. Time and space aren't actually taken up because there isn't time and space out there. Rather, what there is it occurs in what I call time, and it occurs in what I call space.
Okay, so time and space are in my mind. They're not.
Such as I know them, yeah. Yeah, you know what it's like? Here's what it's like.
So we don't know that they actually exist, we just think that they do,
well,
they might, but they might not?
Think about it this way.
Okay.
Okay, you know with color,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
So like, like, take the color blue.
Uh-huh.
Now you think about the color blue, and blue seems like this basic, necessary, natural thing that's out there in the world, right? But all color is if you ask anyone who does biophysical operations with this stuff, color is simply a wavelength that's being absorbed by an object where everything else is being reflected within the electromagnetic spectrum. There's no such thing as blue out there. What there is a wavelength that's
There's a perception of the reflection.
that's absent,
and yet that
and we're
doesn't
perceiving.
mean that blue is in your mind.
Yeah, right. That's right. It doesn't mean this blue is in your mind, but what that thing called blue is in your mind.
It manifests itself.
So to put it in Kantian terms, the condition for the possibility of that which we call blue isn't in your mind, but that thing, that event called blue, is. Space and time, exactly the same way. The condition for the possibility of time, temporality, and the condition for the possibility of space, spatiality, are not in your mind. They're part of the nature of things in themselves. But what that is, as far as we know it, in this basic level of space and time, it's like color. It's in your. That is in your. That it does have to do with
the way that we experience it is in our mind. But doesn't that, in a way, mean that we do have access to it in some way?
But we don't know what that is. That's the problem, because you can't. I mean, it's like it'd be nice to be able to say, "Oh yeah," so we can get beyond it and transcend it and think about it as it really is. Except you can't even begin to build the concept for it.
But isn't what Kant's saying that we might not be able to build it, but we do have some kind of access?
No. That's
okay.
the problem. Because you can't.
So don't be like me. Don't get this wrong.
Because
don't get this wrong like
because
this.
Because you can't.
Don't be me. Okay. Don't get it wrong that way.
because you can't build the concept. Right? You can't even begin to build the concept. This is what's radical about Kant. You can't build it. You can't even begin to build it. You know it's there.
We can experience it.
Yeah. I mean, you can know the horizon's there. You can't ever get to it, and you can't ever even approach it. You can move towards it in some way, and you can organize all sorts of things, but you ain't going to get there because there ain't no place to get to. It's not even a place, really. It's just in relation to places. Well, you know what? Space and time are like that. There's this reality to them. It's in your mind, but you can't get there. You can't, because there's no there to get to.
And is he saying the same thing about the cosmos?
Well,
I'm sorry if I'm.
I don't know what you mean by the cosmos. What do you mean?
Everything.
The totality of things?
Wait, with the cosmos, cosmology, that's the unity of everything, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if he's saying that about the cosmos per se. It's talking more about things in themselves.
So basically, it sounds to me like what he's saying is that because we experience things like blue and light and space and time at the phenomenal level in our minds, the very fact that we experience them as such means that there must be some underlying condition for their possibility, and that's noumenal, and we don't have access to that. But we know that it's there.
Right.
Because in order for us to experience them phenomenally, there must be that condition for their possibility.
We must suppose it, though we know not what it is. Yeah.
Is that right?
That's right.
All right.
That's right. That's right. And then that creates this strange, weird position of saying, so, I mean, you know, Kant's really, he's really tantalizing. He's saying the synthetic a priori is there. Okay, so the path to metaphysics, it's there. It seems like the noumenal reality, right? The condition that's the condition for the possibility of things being, it's there. It all seems like it's there. It seems like it has to be there. Seems like it. But when you investigate the basic terms by which the mind works and thinks about ideas, it ain't going to get there. And that's the
Our
problem.
mind.
Our mind.
Our mind isn't going to get there.
Well, but you can't. That's right. But you got to be careful in saying that, because you don't want to say it's something like, yeah, but God's mind could. I mean, what? Because then he would say, well, what's that even mean? That doesn't even lead to a concept, you know.
It doesn't sound like any individual mind could, because it's bound by the limits of its own perceptions.
Right, that's right. And it's not. And if you try to say something mystical like, well, what about God's mind, or the totality of minds, or some transcendental mind? You know, as some might say, that this would be something that mystics would say. It's actually pronounced in a lot of Indian thought in various ways. But the Kantian point about this, and it's a good point, is fine if you want to say that, but what precisely would you be talking about? All you're doing is being indicative. You're pointing at that, and being indicative isn't saying. It's not knowing truth. It's just saying, oh, it's gotta be, you know, up there. I mean, isn't
that kind of like saying that, yeah, we suppose that there is something that allows for the possibility of being, but, well, I guess he's just saying that you can't specify it in any sort of a way. Like, yeah, there's something.
No. Because
okay.
Here's the thing. You can't even say this sounds picky, but
by all means,
you can't even say it's a thing, really. Because a thing.
There is a possibility of
being.
Well,
a thing has a quality of existence to it, right? A thing has thatness to it. A thing is there, and think about it. if something is there, it has qualities of space and time. He's not even willing to give it that. All he's talking about is there must be some condition for the possibility of giving rise to it. I mean, it's tricky, but
Condition.
a condition for the
Must be some
possibility, right?
condition.
Not a cause,
Not
but
a thing.
yeah, but a condition for the possibility that gives rise to it. And there's a lot of people after Kant too, I should say, that even reject. They say, you were just trying to preserve some sort of...
You were just being a good Lutheran.
Yeah, basically. Right. Saying that there's something out there when there isn't. But Kant, did make bring up this point of saying, well, there seems to be this noumenal condition of reality that we suppose must be present. But what it is, or even to say that it is beyond the power of the mind to see. And this is what we see when we do an investigation of the possibility of pure mathematics in terms of the intuition.